Thank you for joining us today as we're going to be thinking about the State of DevOps report through the lens of data professionals. So, if you are familiar with the State of DevOps report, you've heard of the State of DevOps report, you're like, I like DevOps, I like states, I like reports. Let's put them all together, but especially thinking about this through the lens of data. So, going to jump in a little bit. First, this is what we're going to talk about today. Don't worry, you're wondering who we are. We're going to get right to that, but you're going to have to wait a second. First, we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about. Throughout today in our session here, we are going to talk about the State of DevOps report, why it matters, what it is. We're going to look at some key insights that come out of that annual report, specifically for data professionals. Then we're going to wrap up and think about some things you can do next when you are considering this in your organization and in your team. So, as promised, who are we exactly? And I'm joined by two great folks. I'm going to let them introduce themselves first, and then I'll wrap up the intro there.
Awesome. Thank you, Matty. Thank you for having us. I'm Amanda Lewis. I'm a developer advocate on the DORA advocacy team at Google Cloud. And so I get to work with teams and learn how they get better at getting better at delivering software. And I also help lead up the DORA community of practice.
And hi, everyone. My name is Nathen Harvey. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having us, Matty. I lead up DORA here at Google Cloud. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the insights that we have over our decade worth of research with DORA. And we'll get right to that here in just a minute.
If you're like me, you're wondering, you keep talking about DORA, and I don't know what that means, but good news, we're going to get to that in just a second. My name is Matty Stratton. I run developer relations here at Aiven, and I'm a big fan of DevOps and a big fan of DORA and a big fan of data. So we're going to bring all these things together, the chocolate and the peanut butter, and the third thing that goes with chocolate and peanut butter. I don't know what that is. So, Nathen, what's going on? Tell us about this report, man.
Yeah, well, let me start with that question of what exactly is DORA. DORA is an ongoing research program that looks into how do teams and organizations get better at delivering and operating software. And in order to do that, we go out into the world and we run a survey every single year. And we ask a bunch of questions. We gather a bunch of data. This data that we get comes from organizations of every shape and size. You know, we're talking to 150-year-old banks, and we're talking to technology startups that began, well, yesterday. So we really get a ton of insight across the entire industry. This leads to some real challenges like, how do you even measure software delivery performance? We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But the most important thing is that we want to use DORA to help us get better at getting better. You see, understanding how do we get better at getting better? How do we adopt and embrace a mindset and a practice of continuous improvement? Well, that's what DORA is all about. So if you have not yet heard of the State of DevOps report, now you have, so you can't say that anymore. Your next step is to go download the State of DevOps report, which you can get to at dora.dev/report. Of course, dora.dev is where you'll find all kinds of information about DORA, and you can take the next step in your journey to get better at getting better. But like I said, one of our challenges here that we've had to face as a research program is how do you actually measure software delivery performance? Amanda, I think you have some insights there.
Thank you, Nathen. I do, because I think it's important if we want to get better at getting better, first we have to know how are we doing? And so one of the fantastic things that have come out of the DORA research over the last decade is how we can reliably measure software delivery performance. And this is, as you were saying, you could be in a large enterprise, you could be a startup, you could be working on a mobile application, firmware. It really doesn't matter what type of software you're delivering. These metrics apply. And so we're looking at both your throughput and stability, that lead time for changes, your deployment frequency. And then when we are deploying, how often when we put that out there, do we have to roll something back? And specifically, we're looking at that failed deployment recovery time. So we're looking at when you've deployed software, when has that you've required, how long did it take you to put it back service to where it was before you deployed that software? Not necessarily looking at if maybe you had an outage in your data center, but more specifically on the software you're delivering. And so I'm curious, Matty, when you're thinking about these metrics and software delivery performance metrics, how do data professionals think about this?
I think what's interesting to me is I look at this and I think we shouldn't necessarily think about it all that differently, because fundamentally, when we think about software delivery, we're talking about what's one of the key words that comes up here in almost every single one in one way or another is about change, right? We are making change to a system, to add a feature, to fix a bug, to add capacity, all sorts of things to move our business forward. And data is part of that, right? We have the data, whether it has to do with just as simple as thinking about our schema. By the way, I can't believe I just said simple and schema in the same sentence. A lot of people are going to be mad about that. Schema can be complicated, but whether we're thinking about the infrastructure of that data, whether it's in the context of its schema and its design, so we're enabling the things that we want that application to do differently or that service, or the data that drives it, the metadata, the pieces and parts, not just the orders that come in from our outside world, but also the data that drives that application, and that we capture about that. So when we think about these metrics, they apply either in concert because there's something that's directly connected to what you would think is that traditional scoping of the application, or something that might be happening not directly aligned, but we're still looking, how long does it take? When I think about that lead time for changes, are we able to make those changes that we need to have that agility and that nimbleness that our business demands? Are we able to do that quickly? Are we able to make those changes in small things? Because I think about older school ways of releasing, when we think about these, again, those schema change, are we moving this massive change to the data, or are we able to do it in piecemeal batches that are smaller? We think about the stability pieces; those are part and parcel. And I think a lot about, we'll dig into all of these things in greater detail. But I think about older deployments that I used to do in infrastructure when we were the data pieces of how much of these things were different. And because anything that touches data almost makes us inherently feel like it's riskier than just, oh, that's just some code. So we get nervous about deployment frequency. We get nervous about all those things that inherently actually bring us more stability, ironically enough, right? So
I think that's a really good point, because one of the things that we've discovered over the 10 years, if you go back to like sort of the more traditional way of thinking, is that throughput and stability are trade-offs of one another. We can either increase our throughput or we can increase our stability. So how do we increase stability? Well, let's slow down on that throughput. And really what we've found in our research is that that's simply not true. They aren't trade-offs of one another. They tend to move together. So you get stability through higher throughput. But again, to one of the points that you made about data, we can't do that with big changes. And so really the key insight here is that smaller changes are able to move through the system faster. And when they land in production, they're more stable. And so when we think about data, whether it's schema, database schema, or the data itself, how can we take large changes and break them down into smaller changes that we can get fast feedback on, and we can use those always moving through the pipeline so that we get that throughput and stability. But these metrics matter. Amanda.
But how do they matter, right? So I think when we're looking here, you see that we've just been talking about our software delivery performance metrics, and it's in the green box. And you need to measure your performance. But what we found is that measuring your performance, how you do it, software delivery, it predicts outcomes for your organization. So we look at that. The better you get at software delivery performance, the better outcomes you're going to have for your organization. And maybe even, I think more importantly, we're looking at how does it affect the well-being of your team? And we see that it has a positive effect. It predicts better well-being. But, as Nathen was saying, that it seems, if we increase something, we can't have the same quality. But what we found over these years is that's true. And part of that, such as working in small batches. But Nathen, what other things? We've got all this stuff to the left. What is this?
Yeah, the things on the left of software delivery performance here are capabilities. These are the capabilities that drive software delivery performance. It's almost as if you can think of software delivery performance as a leading indicator for those outcomes, but it's a trailing indicator for sort of your technical practices, your technical teams. What work are they doing? And that's where the technical capabilities come in, but also things like culture and process. So in order to get better at those software delivery performance metrics, the idea behind Dora is to find your bottleneck on the other side, which capabilities are holding you back, and let's go improve those capabilities. Again, whether they're technical, process, or cultural capabilities.
I
And each year, what we do is we go and investigate a number of these capabilities. We look at, outcomes and measures and so forth, and then we publish findings. So we wanted to share quickly some high-level findings from the most recent report that we published. So we'll start with culture. Look, culture is super important. In fact, it's foundational. Nothing that you do matters if you don't have a good culture in place. We're going to dig into each one of these a lot deeper here in just a minute. We want to just cover off on them really quickly. Second up is user centricity. Do you care about your users? Are you focused on their needs? And then third, quality documentation. Look, we have to write and maintain our documentation. It's really important and is a key predictor of better technical capabilities and organizational and software delivery performance.
And then flexible infrastructure, we hear how, the great benefits that we can get from the cloud, but what it really is when we're using it and we're creating flexible infrastructure for our teams and underrepresented groups, how we show up for our team, how we share work, how we distribute work across our team really matters on our well-being and our outcomes. And then last but not least, code review speed. Those teams that have faster code reviews have 50% higher software delivery performance.
And what I'd like to do now is we're going to go ahead and take from these key insights, these sort of 6 points, and saying, let's look at them through that lens of the data professional, right? See if there's not necessarily do they apply or do they not, but we can play that a little bit. But also, let's put it in that language, let's put it in that perspective, and we'll go ahead. And I think the first one that we're going to really want to think about is that first one, which is really the healthy culture. And this is one of those things that we could spend an hour on. We could do a whole conference on culture, and it's could go in a couple different ways, right? It could be because we're really excited to talk about it. It could also be a lot of people that say, I don't want to talk about this at all. And I always, anytime we think about culture, organizational culture, and especially through the DevOps lens, is I always think about early in the DevOps movement, there was kind of a minor splinter movement that was called the enterprise DevOps movement, and it was noted for saying it was everything about DevOps except the culture part, because the culture part didn't matter in an enterprise. And the proponent of this was fond of saying culture is for yogurt, and the fact that nobody knows who I'm talking about talks about how well that was adopted. And luckily we know this. But the one thing I think about with culture, and then Nathen and Amanda, I'd like to hear you think about that, is culture is not the kind of is a hard one to work with, and it's not the kind of thing where you just do that by fiat, right? You can't come in and say, I'm the new CIO, I'm the new leader, and this is the culture we're going to have. Like, culture is emergent based upon behaviors. And I think that's one of the key things to think about, is that it's kind of an indirect, and also it's one of the hardest of all these metrics we're going to talk about. It's one of the hardest ones to measure, because you can't go put like an agent on all of your folks and find out how they're working, right? We actually might have to measure culture through things like talking to people, or so more qualitative versus quantitative. But I guess we kind of start with that and then think about, because again, like you said, culture is a big meatball of a word. So maybe we could talk about some specific things that come to mind.
I think, it's really the foundation. And I agree when you were saying you can't just come in and say, now we're going to have a generative culture. And it's really about how you work and creating opportunities. If you first, I think it's using maybe a survey. We have survey questions on Dora.dev that can be used to evaluate how you're doing currently within your culture of your organization or your team. But if you want to improve that, it's finding those opportunities to maybe change the way you work. So even, if we talk about blamelessness, which is a part of the generative culture, when there is an issue and something comes up, do you get together? Do you walk through and go over what the incident was without placing blame on any one person, but really thinking about the system and how can we improve the system so that it doesn't let us down next time? Nathen, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that spot on to everything that you all have said. I also think when I think about culture and specifically like from a data professional's perspective, right? Well, culture, is there finger pointing happening? Is there that's not my job happening, right? As a data professional, maybe all I care about is the schema and the indexes in that database and the performance of the database. The application, and that's someone else's job. I don't care about that. But it's understanding that we're in this together. And this culture is about that connective tissue. Are we learning from each other? Do we understand the goals of the application that sits on top of our database? Do the application professionals understand our concerns and constraints when it comes to how we manage and scale and protect the data that we're responsible for? So it really is a lot about that idea of collaboration. And Matty, you said something really important there that, you can't change culture by fiat. The truth is that culture is something that's always changing. It is not static. And the good news of that is that, well, you can't change it by fiat. You can probably start to impact it through incentives, right? And the truth is that if you don't have leaders that are modeling and incentivizing good behaviors and good culture, then the practitioners trying to do so probably aren't going to get there. On the other hand, if you look around and say, well, I'm not a leader on this team, I might call a little bit of BS. I think that we all have some leadership skills and opportunities. And the way that each of us as an individual shows up at work, shows up with and for our teammates, that is part of the culture of our organization. And so I think it's a yes and. It's not an either or. It is absolutely something that can be managed from the top and incentivized properly, and we put the right structures in place. And it is something that we at the practitioner level can also help drive.
There's a quote that I've used constantly from Lloyd Taylor, who was the VP of infrastructure at a company called Gmoko. But Taylor said you can't directly change culture, but you can change behavior, and behavior becomes culture. And Nathen also said incentives drive behavior. Now, so there's I really kind of like that framing, and I think maybe we'll do this throughout some of the rest of the points is, what are the things you do when you do have an accountability to a team? You're in a position of perceived authority, real or perceived authority, to be able to say, because oftentimes you're saying, hey, I'm the DBA, I'm an SRE, I can't change how the team works, but we actually can do quite a few things in how we model. But again, there's different capabilities, right? It can't change our org chart if I'm not the CIO, but what can we do that don't require that? And I think thinking about it again through the data lens, and then kind of move to the next one, is like collaborative piece. I think is part of the culture, which is rather than sort of thinking about it as the application team, they're users, they're your, again, we want to, we like the idea of treating our coworkers as customers, but maybe they're not actually your customers, they are your colleagues. And we're here to put this service into place versus saying, hey, I provide this thing. I'm not database as a service to you. I'm a collaborator. So let's understand what we're trying to accomplish, because we can help each other. And there's ways you ease into that. If your organization's not set up for that today, you can't flip that switch and just suddenly say, now we do that, because you're not staffed for it. You're not built for that. But there's ways to start to think about, how can you, if you are working if you're a data team that works in a big silo right now, and you're like, hey, I can't go and change how we do things together. Maybe there's areas of opportunity to say, hey, can we do something that's not necessarily part of our sprint process or whatever, and go into that, but even say, hey, once a month, do we do a brown bag together to just say what's coming, what are the problems, what are the challenges, and how do we work together in kind of that collaborative way. And then speaking of not treating our colleagues as users, well, how do we treat our users as colleagues? Maybe, I don't know. Is that a transition to that work? That might not have worked. We'll find out. But either way, the bubble says we're talking about user centricity now. So here we go.
Well, and I think that's key. Whether or not the transition worked, we put the users in the center. And so
There
it
you go.
must have worked, right? And so what do we mean when we talk about user centricity? It's really about that idea of understanding who are the users of your system, who are the customers of your system. And maybe from a data professional, maybe you're providing services to others within your organization. So maybe you feel disconnected from the eventual end user, or maybe you are feeling connected to that eventual end user. If you think about like an e-commerce website as an example, right? Nobody comes to an e-commerce website because of the database that you're using or because of the schema. Oh, I'm never going back to that. That store uses a NoSQL database. I'm never shopping there again. Said no customer ever, right? And so this is really about how do you connect to those users. And one of the ways that we measure that in our research is, are you actively changing your roadmap or the features that you're going to deliver based on feedback and signal that you're getting from your users, right? At the end of the day, we're all here to make our users happy and create great experiences for them. One of the things that's really nice about user centricity as a way of thinking about this is, one, it can help us deliver software better and faster, and maybe the right software when we start thinking about that. But it has implications for other areas as well. I think a lot about site reliability engineering or your operations team. What do they mean when we talk about reliability? Well, it's not how utilized or underutilized are your CPUs. How much free memory do you have? These are things that we might be monitoring, but they don't really tell us anything about the service levels that our customers are getting. And so it is really taking that customer-centric or user-centric approach to measuring reliability. If you think about a platform engineering team or even a data team, who are the users that you're building for? If a data team just comes in and says, you know what, the right thing for us to do is to, I don't know, eliminate eliminate all of the indexes because then we'll have better performance. I know that's a terrible example, but I'm exposing myself as not a data professional. So let's say we got rid of all the indexes. That'll improve performance. They aren't really thinking necessarily about who's responsible for that. Or maybe the data engineers say, man, we get so many different schema requests. Let's put in a heavyweight process to slow down the requests for change that we get. That might be a problem, both from a culture perspective, a process perspective, and most importantly, you're not thinking about who your user is. And so there are some things there, I think, that are really important.
When I think, Nathen, it is kind of this building block, right? So you have the culture, and then you're focusing on the user, and being able to, Matty, you were talking about how maybe we can't, change something big within our team. There's something big and lofty we want to do, but can we start small? And I think within any application team, if we're all talking together, if we spend time even looking at, so the software delivery metrics, if you on Dora.dev, we have a quick check where you can go through with your team and have a conversation about how you're doing with deploying and your lead time and your change fail rate. But what that really leads to is these conversations that almost always are going to start to talk about users and the impact on the users. And I think it helps bring us together and have a shared language so that it makes it easier for us to work together and to connect both the work I'm doing to the user, but then also if Matty reaches out to me, we've got a language that we can speak that is shared so that we can collaborate easier.
That's really, really interesting. The thing I was thinking about is that if we can think about to like Nathen said, maybe your user is other teams, as feature teams that you're providing this service, right, as a platform. And the trade-off of that is you have to then kind of treat it like a product, right? And bring all that in, because to have that sort of interface point, right? It's now a product, and that's great. And that's one way to accomplish this kind of thing. But to that, you have to provide the guardrails and all of the things like you would if this was a user that was not, getting a paycheck from the same, signed by the same person as you, right? So there's one way to think about that. And so if we want to treat our colleagues and coworkers as consumers, then we do that, right? And it doesn't mean that like we're like jerks to them and we don't talk to them or anything, but we're saying, cool, you have this interface point, right? It's like, this is the API and this is how it's defined. And that has one thing. Now, the other thing that prevents you from being able to do is actually really, in a lot of ways, be user obsessed with your colleague, which is helping them with the things they don't even know, right? Because, and there's lots of reasons we don't necessarily always quote Henry Ford, but there's sort of the anecdata or a sort of apocryphal comment about, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So if you're saying provide this thing and I'm just doing what the feature team says, there could be this whole thing where you're like, you're doing this all in a really batchy way. And if we did event streaming, there's all sorts of, and they'll be like, I didn't even know that was a thing you could do. And you're like, cool, because I'm the data pro. The pro is in the name, right? So that collaborative level, because now it's not a request. It's not like a ticket system that I build the thing you asked me for. It's more, what are you trying to do? And let's how can we consolidate this idea or bring, the sum is greater than the whole is greater. I don't know, math, right? So we're going to do some collaboration math is what we're leaning for. And these transitions practically write themselves, because we're saying, if you're going to have this defined interface point, well, it has to be documented. So, I mean, this is one of these that everyone, by the way, you're watching this, and if this is the part I'm going to walk away for a few minutes, because the last thing I need is another lecture on documentation. That's fine, whatever. Nobody reads it. All wikis are write only, all this kind of thing. So how do we solve for that, actually? Because it's a real problem. We know we want it, but nobody wants to do it, right?
Well, I think you're spot on. And what we see in our research is a couple of things. One, that quality documentation leads to better strength in those technical capabilities. So if you want to get better at data management, as an example, having good quality internal documentation around what are the processes, what are the procedures, what are the whys and the wherefores of data management, having that captured in good quality documentation is important. And then one of the ways that we measure that is, are teams actually using the documentation? Is the documentation staying up to date with the ever-changing architecture, processes, etc., within our organizations? And in the 2022 report, I believe it was 21 or 22, whatever it takes.
Time is
one of the things that we talked about was, how do you encourage better quality documentation? And what we found was that the teams that have structures in place, systems in place that look at things like, how old is this documentation? I know internally at Google, we have a system where when a document or any piece of documentation reaches a certain age, a bug is automatically opened up into that engineering team's backlog. It says, hey, there's a freshness check that you need to do on this document. Also, is documentation rewarded during performance and promotion reviews? Is this something that comes up? This is really important, and it's a critical way for us to remind folks of the quality documentation really matters.
That freshness check, I shouldn't assume, but I'm going to hope that the answer to that freshness check can be, nope, it's fine.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't want to reward okay, well, I guess I better update it because I have to, because it's going to be on my review if I don't update the documentation. So I'm just going to go change the order of a couple words so that it's, because there are systems that are heritage systems that are this literally is never going to change. And it's fine. The docs were written in 2004 and we have not changed a damn thing about it. So that's totally good. And, and even perhaps you might be able to, in your system, even maybe flag systems like that, which don't need as often of a freshness check maybe, or they're sort of this is just in,
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to get into a state where in odd years, the word is happy, and in even years, the word is glad. That's
by the way, if you are in an organization apparently where you have this kind of thing, there's your workaround. So There's a couple people watching this right now that are like, "That's the most valuable thing I learned in this entire webinar
Yes.
was how to
Please.
beat the system." So
Yeah, if that's the state, like, go get your bonus. And if that means changing happy to glad every other year, do that. But in the meantime, you're right. Freshness check is just that. Is this documentation still fresh? Is it still accurate? And the answer can be yes. It's good. It's good to go. You don't have to change anything.
Well, and again, I think this is where it's building up, right? So hopefully within your organization, if you want to encourage better quality documentation, you would have a culture where you don't want someone gaming the system. You want them thinking about the user. Why are we right? Why is the documentation in place? Why is that important? Why should we take that moment to make sure that it's good and that it's helping our internal users? It is, we want to help that user and we want to be thinking about that user, and just changing from happy to, was it glad?
Glad.
Maybe it was nice. Yeah. Probably isn't going to have that impact that we want to have.
these days with AI and stuff, it's probably even easier to game that, where you just be Chat GPT, rewrite my documentation ever so slightly. You're going to see a lot of requests like that. So,
Right. And I do think we're going to see some interesting things, the way AI may help us change the way we work so that we find it easier to provide good quality documentation.
So when we think about the findings around flexible infrastructure, and this can go a lot of different ways too. I mean, this again is sort of the promise of cloud, right? Which is giving us that on demand, just what we need kind of piece. And I think when we think about data, this is a tricksy one, because there's a couple things that maybe at first look kind of go counter to the conventional wisdom around cloud, right? I mean, first of all, for the longest time, and again, some of this is a little bit dated, and I'm sure our Kubernetes friends will tell me, that this is not necessarily the case. But when we think about stateful versus stateless, like, so much of the beginnings of cloud were built around stateless things, because that was sort of thing. It's disposable infrastructure, it's ephemeral, it's idempotent, it's whatever other words that Nathen and I used to learn when we worked at Chef about all these things. But like, and then until you hit the database, right? Until you hit your data systems, where you're like, because the challenges with the data systems against all this other stuff is that your data systems don't scale horizontally, they scale vertically. They're big. You can't just tear them down and start over. They are not again, ephemeral. They are not just sort of like, all right, start from scratch, kind of do this thing. And data has gravity, right? Both in terms and both almost literally and figuratively, right? Because you need to be close to the data. So you got to figure out where I put this so I can't. So that actually brings some challenges with your flexibility, but also it can take a long time, right? Like, I mean, it's still the fastest bandwidth, right? Is like a semi trailer full of hard drives of your data driving down the expressway is going to move your giant petabyte database, faster than, all those pieces. So when we think about the flexibility of that infrastructure, right, it gives us the ability to be reactive. And it brings into light another challenge that I think data pros who are providing this type of thing probably have encountered. And there's this idea called Javon's paradox. And so Javon was a researcher, and this all goes back to coal prices in England in the last century. And what Javon found was that the cheaper and easier it was to consume something is that people consume it more, even if they don't necessarily need it. And we see this today in a lot of different ways, but that's definitely been true with cloud within organizations, private, public, whatever you want to call it. Is, hey, this is cool, it's really easy, so I'm just going to kind of default to that. And then you end up with a lot of sprawl. So that flexibility I guess that's sort of the conversation, is it gives us this great flexibility, but what are the things we have to think about to not be bit by that flexibility, right? Not suddenly have this giant amorphous blob that is our infra that we have no visibility into or understanding, because it was so easy to do.
There's a lot to unpack on what you just shared. And I think, one of the things that we see over the years, and it definitely comes out through the research, is that when how we started using cloud and how most of us, our first exploration with cloud was not actually flexible infrastructure, right? We didn't know how to use cloud appropriately yet. And so I think as we've seen, and I know I keep saying how these build up upon each other, but we now with platform engineering, right, and internal developer platforms, providing some of that, visibility into cost and putting guardrails in place and really thinking about our internal users, our engineers, our data professionals, and helping them they shouldn't have to become experts in all of that, but we want them to be able to move fast if they've got a new idea and we get user feedback and we want to change, we want to have access to those resources, but with guardrails in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that, I love the phrasing that you use there, Matty. It's starting to ask questions, right? And when we think about, okay, now we have this really flexible infrastructure. Let's take a really old school example. Like in the past, if we ran our applications in a data center and we wanted to have another data center that we could move them to, boy, there's a lot of work in that. When we move to the cloud, if we're running in a region and we want to move to another region, there's still work. Never fear. It's maybe not the same level or scope of work. But when you think about the speed with which you could move compute resources from one region to the next, we go back to that data gravity problem and we start thinking about, oh, well, but if I move my compute over to this region over here, now it's so far disconnected from the data, which is off in that other region. Maybe it gives us insights that what we need to do is maybe make sure that we're replicating that data across different regions, and the cost of doing that is well worth it because of the infrastructure flexibility that we have, the ability to move things around. I also think that, when we start thinking then in a more global sense, and I mean that particularly global sense, like where's our carbon footprint? And are we able to move our infrastructure to follow the sun so that we can use less carbon throughout the day? The cloud certainly gives us that flexibility, but does our data support that? Or is our data gravity keeping us in maybe less optimal places as we're running our infrastructure? And so I think it starts to bring up some really interesting questions. I also think it gets to this question of abstraction layers, right? As Amanda mentioned, from a platform engineering perspective, if I'm a developer, should I be coming to you and saying, Matty, I need PostgreSQL version X.Y for this application? Or should I be coming to you and saying, I need a data store for this application? Or I need a structured data store for this application, or an unstructured data store? Maybe as the application developer, I should also have the flexibility to just provision a data store. And I'm not really concerned. That's the data professional's job to really provide that professional insight as to what type of data store is running underneath.
I think that's interesting too, because the word infrastructure is a loaded term, right? When we think about flexible infrastructure, we've already started going down this path of kind of talking about compute and store, like the stuff that feels like infra, like the plumbing. But there's a lot of other infra, like you started to talk about that a little bit, Nathen, which is like what operational store, or even thinking about how do I make what are features of my data infrastructure that give me more flexibility? Again, as we start to think about doing something more that's real time with streaming, that takes some of those challenges away, because if I'm like, I just have this big honking operational data store that is now giant, that has to be wherever, and I have to keep those things in sync and everything. And you're like, but if I'm really just thinking about this from a streaming perspective, the scaling changes completely, and there's a lot of technologies and approaches to our data infrastructure that give us more flexibility. So that flexibility is not inherently just on demand, spin something up, spin it down, cloudy. You can have this flexible infrastructure and not touch the cloud at all, right? You can think about the ways that you make your infra more flexible to provide the thing that you need, even if you're living in your own data centers and you don't go outside of anything. It's not flexible infrastructure does not inherently mean cloud, I guess.
In fact, you could also be on the cloud and have a very inflexible infrastructure. right? So
They
like,
are not
no,
tightly coupled in either way.
Right.
they are not. They are not. And that's the real finding of our research over the past few years. It's not, are you using the cloud, yes or no? It's more about how are you using the cloud. And when we talk about flexible infrastructure, we are talking about self-service provisioning. We are talking about the ability to have rapid elasticity. And just a reminder, elasticity goes both ways, right? It's not just scale up, scale up, scale up, scale out. It's also bring that back down, right? And so all of these are components of that flexible infrastructure. And the story that we often use, or that I often use, is, when you move from the data center to the cloud, did you change the process? Or are developers still opening up a ticket that sits in a queue and it waits for someone to respond to it, and then they get something back and they're disappointed because it wasn't exactly what they asked for, maybe because they didn't know how to ask what they were asking for. And there's a lot of back and forth in a ticketing queue before you actually have access to the things that you needed from the beginning. If the answer to that is no, you probably don't have flexible infrastructure regardless of where it's running.
So another area we saw in insights was around underrepresented groups and how they work in the organization, and areas of improvement, and also where those areas become superpowers. So I'd like to, maybe we can dig into this one a little bit more, because it also is not necessarily as like, and they've all had some ways we've been deconstructing what they're about, but this one might seem a little bit may need a little bit more untying.
Well, I think, one of the key findings was that, underrepresented groups experience more burnout. And then kind of couple that with the fact that they tend to do more of the repetitive work, that toilsome work, and the work that doesn't maybe get you promoted or get rewarded. And so, kind of tying with that, we looked at how work is distributed and the importance of distributing work fairly across the team and having a process for it. So it's not even, I think, sometimes this comes about not out of bad intent by anybody on the team, but when we don't have proper processes in place, then this kind of just starts to happen, and we're all busy and we don't recognize that it's happening, but it's definitely coming through within the research.
Yeah, that
I think
idea
maybe
of,
the word is intentionality when it comes to that, as opposed like the process, but also that intentionality, right?
Yeah.
And it's true for a lot of things of this nature. Even if you think about things like remote work and whatever, where you're like you said, Amanda, this stuff doesn't just happen. You
Right.
have to, and especially when you've got 100 other things going on, if you don't have the intentionality to say, how do we look at making sure that we're dividing work equitably and equally, and giving everybody the cool stuff, but also the boring stuff, right?
Right.
Because otherwise it's just going to happen. And there's folks, and they tend to be more underrepresented folks who have the tendency of being like, well,
Yeah.
someone's going to have to do this, so I might as well, right? And
Right.
if you're someone that looks more like me, that could get away with being like, oh, whatever, someone will clean up my socks, right?
Right.
Like that's,
Well, and one of those places is documentation. We've definitely seen that, underrepresented groups are more likely to, and when I say prioritize, they're just probably adding that to the rest of their work to ensure that there's good quality documentation. And that's a place where you could probably easily get started with distributing how documentation is completed on your team. And that probably immediately would bring down some of that across the board. We can get that. You agree?
yeah, I think it is really important that we understand and have those conversations around how is work being distributed. And I want to, we all have a responsibility to make sure that everyone on the team has an opportunity to shine. And you can't have an opportunity to shine if you're consistently taking on those non-promotable tasks, the work that holds everything together, but maybe is somewhat invisible, maybe isn't really valued as much. We have to make sure that we're distributing that well. I mean, we learned these things through things like our on-call rotations as a good example. Just the fact that we have a rotation says, look, we've thought about how burnout might impact a particular individual or a particular group of individuals. Think about the same things in all of the work that you do. How do we make sure that everyone has equal opportunity to shine and is carrying their own weight together with the rest of the team?
And then our final insight was around the code review speed. And this feels like to me one of those where, again, if I'm looking at this through the data pro lens, I'm like, oh, well, this one doesn't matter to me because I don't write code. First of all, you do probably. But really, if we can take the word code and we're just sort of saying, and we're not going to say change review because that's a loaded term that gives a lot of us the shivers, of times of our change review speed. But whenever it comes to that, I guess if we kind of ferret out the core of this discovery, I think it probably comes down to a lot more about how quickly we're able to make those changes. But I'm guessing that you don't find a high code review speed by just doing LGTM on everything and going boom, GIF, go, right? So what are some of the maybe the practices that you've seen that increase code review speed without it being just now it's a rubber stamp?
Yeah, this is really about getting fast, high quality feedback. And actually, just like everything else, it builds on the previous topic. Let's think about people who identify as underrepresented. Are they being asked to do more code reviews or fewer code reviews? Or are we looking at a code review that's maybe submitted or a change that's submitted by them in a different light? Or are we putting it under more scrutiny than we might against someone who is well represented within our team or within our community? So I think those two things really tie together as well. But when it comes to code review speed, it is really about that. How do we get faster feedback? And if you're a data professional, maybe you don't feel like you're writing code. Maybe none of your configurations are living in version control. Although if they aren't, maybe we should have a different conversation. Maybe they should live in version control. But hopefully you're not making changes independently without someone else helping you, another data professional looking over your shoulder or looking at that giant schema change that you're about to run in production. If there's someone else looking at it, I think that we'll all have better confidence and trust. And if something were to go wrong, then at least two people have looked at that change shortly before it was enacted. So what we found, of course, was that code review speed, teams with faster code review speed have 50% better software delivery performance. So if you can improve the speed, and of course the quality goes along with that, it's not just about LGTM. In fact, I saw someone recently post on Twitter, I think it was, that LGTM is a thing that happens. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it stands for looks good to me. Like, oh yeah, that code change looks good to me. Someone also proposed that we should start normalizing TLDR. And TLDR means too long, didn't read. So if you have a giant change set, it's not actually an LGTM, it's more like a TLDR. Rubber stamp, pass it through. But when it comes to the data professional, I think the same is true, right? We want to make smaller changes. They're easier to understand and reason about so that we can provide higher quality feedback on those changes faster. When you have a large set of things that are changing all at once, it's much more difficult to reason about that and really understand what are the implications of this size of a change.
So I just want to unlock something here and there's a couple things to balance, but we talked about how to improve the culture of collaboration. And years ago, a fellow named Jez Humble said this, and I heard him and I stick with it, which is version control is just a communication tool for developers, right? So rather than sitting and saying, I was saying, hey, you could do brown bag, you do all those things too, but the other thing is having collaborative version control when it comes into that. And now we said we want to make those code reviews faster. So most folks are probably watching this going, well, Matty, how are you going to make it faster by having more people be involved? But I think that helps us build the muscle of those more, maybe not necessarily atomic changes, but like the smaller pieces, but having more eyes on them, even if it's a matter of that review may not require approval. And also that's an interesting one. And I'm curious, review does not mean approval. It means it's there to be looked at, and you can be a non-voting reviewer, right? Which just means I can look at that, I can see, and I can speak up, but I'm not blocking. And I think maybe that's a way to ease into that as well, which is to say, cool, we actually want this part of the data team involved in the code review of the application, but we're not gonna, because the worst thing in the world is to be put in place as a blocker for someone else, and you're too busy to do it. Now you're keeping them from doing anything, and now you feel like an awful person. So I think maybe that's one way to start, is started in like not even read only mode, but sort of like voice but no vote or whatever, but you're reviewing it. And now you have insight, what's going on over in those teams, because we're treating our our version control, our place where this happening. It's like just a communication tool. We communicate through those changes.
So, I mean, I know it's obvious that if it's a smaller piece of code, it's going to be faster to review, which leads to everything else we've really learned through the research. But the things that were really interesting to me that we found, that those teams that had faster code reviews, it's the culture. They have a learning culture. If they're doing peer programming, they're learning from one another. They're helping each other. They're pairing, junior developers with senior developers. And it's really about how the processes that they've put in place to the way that their team works to improve their code review speed. So it's, we think just about the code, or we think about the person reviewing, but it was interesting to see how the mechanisms that are put in place, and over time, like you were even saying, so if maybe I'm new to a team and I get put on as as a reviewer, but I'm really just a read only, my approval means nothing, but by having exposure to that code and exposure to the comments that get put on it, I'm now learning, I'm upskilling, I can have a conversation with the other people on that pull request, and now the whole team is better for it, and onboarding is much faster. And so it really is that culture, focusing on the users within your team. It's spreading, those teams are spreading the code reviews across all of the people within the team. And that's leading to, and they have good documentation. That's the other thing I think that, that came out of it, was that to improve your code review speed, you have to have high quality internal documentation that, when you're writing good code comments, it makes it a lot easier for the reviewer.
That's amazing. And I think when we think about a lot of these different components, and I think about how Aiven can help with quite a few. Now Aiven will not solve every single one of your problems, just 99% of them. But when if you're not familiar with Aiven, so Aiven, we came from 4 frustrated Postgres contributors who were tired of having to build the same DR solutions, security solutions, access control solutions everywhere they went, right? It was everything bespoke. So we think about that flexibility. So Aiven was built as a single solution to give the power of that high-performing, enterprise-ready open source to those who need it without having to build it from the ground up. And then over time, we've incorporated additional high-performing services to meet those requirements. And now Aiven is the trusted open source data platform for everyone. So we think about starting with the database you need at the core, for example, something like Postgres, and then you go out from that, adding that streaming, that monitoring, that analysis, which brings you all those controls as well that you need from the complexity around cost and compliance. So really what you're looking at here is how Aiven normalizes the ownership of these popular open source technologies like Kafka, Postgres, OpenSearch, etc., with a platform that makes sure all of these services run reliably and securely across the cloud, giving you that flexible infrastructure and easy integration with each other as well. So again, that flexibility is kind of built into that. And when we kind of think about that, I'm not going to go into the great detail on here, but you can see we've got lots and lots of different of the highest performing open source data services you have available to you. Again, that provide that flexibility, even like Nathen talked about saying, hey, you as the data pro can say, hey, maybe in this case, let's leverage Grafana here, or actually maybe MySQL might be a better solution than Postgres when it comes to that. And the beautiful thing you have available for you is that we're really good at running all of these things for you, which gives you that ability to have those critical use cases that you might have to manage instead, like dealing with cross-cloud disaster recovery. If you're looking at zero downtime Kafka maintenance and upgrades, et cetera, focus on the right thing. And this gives you that, looking at all those cloud resources around your data in one place, from the uptime to the locality to the cost, what you're running, where you're running it, and how much it costs you. And I'm really excited to have had the conversation that we did today. Nathen, you want to tell us, if people want to know more about Dora, the DevOps research and assessment, that's what Dora is. How can they learn more? How can they get more involved? What's up?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we talked about a bunch of different capabilities, and maybe they sound easy as we're talking about them, but we all know it's not easy. And in fact, we know that you cannot improve alone. And so in embracing that, we've started the Dora community. And we would invite everyone that's listening in to head over to Dora.community, join our mailing list there. We have, of course, a mailing list, but we also get together for a lot of online events. And really, these online events are discussions more than anything else. These are questions. What can we learn from each other? And really take those insights and put them into practice in our own organizations. You'll find that it's a very welcoming, open, inclusive community. We welcome everyone along, whether you consider yourself a DevOps or not. That's really immaterial. It is about how do we get better at getting better.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. We've got a link and a QR code up there for if you'd like to give Aiven a try for yourself. That link will give you an extra $100 in your trial code. So that is my gift to you. And there's a lot to unpack. We learned a lot today, and just scratching the surface. So we can keep that conversation going, both joining the Dora community, like Nathen mentioned, but this is where you can find the three of us on the various social medias and check that out. We're happy to, if you've got some questions, we're happy to hear them. We might even be happy to answer them if we can. And by that, I mean, I'll just tell Nathen I'll just send you to Nathen. I'll be like, here, just go see Mr. Harvey. He'll answer all your DevOps questions. That's how I've made my career. But Amanda and Nathen, thanks for what a really amazing conversation that we had.
Yeah, Matty, thank you so much for having us. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you on the interwebs.